Hello everybody, thank you for taking the time to watch this training video on ways to support children with speech sound difficulties. I'm Hilary Kendrick.
And I'm Pooja Kulkarni.
And we're speech and language therapists working for Bromley Healthcare. In this video, we look at what we mean by the term speech sound difficulty and what are some of the common causes. We learn about the ages and stages of speech sound development in children and then show you some ideas and activities to use with children either at home or preschool or school. So let's begin by thinking about what we mean by speech sound difficulty. You might want to pause the video here and jot down your own definition. Did you manage to think of all these different areas? A child with a speech sound difficulty may find it hard to tell or hear the difference between two sounds, for example a p and a b. They may have difficulty perhaps making the sounds, or they may be able to make the sound on its own but aren't able to use it in words or sentences. The child might find it hard to say longer words or to use the right rhythm, flow or intonation. So children may have a difficulty with just one of these things, for example, listening to sounds, or several. In some cases, they might have difficulty with all these areas, and typically the more difficulties a child has and the greater number of sounds that are affected, the harder the child is to understand. Speech and language therapists tend to categorise speech sound difficulties into different areas or diagnoses, and some of you may be familiar with these terms. So let's start with an articulation difficulty. By this we mean a difficulty making the sounds, and this may or may not be caused by a structural difficulty such as a cleft palate. Examples of an articulation difficulty are a lisp, where a child produces the sound s with their tongue between the teeth, or a lateral s like a k, where the child produces the sound with the air escaping from the side of the tongue. A phonological difficulty affects the child's sound system, meaning their speech is unclear and difficult to follow. Typically, a phonological difficulty isn't caused by any kind of physical disability and is often part of a language delay or disorder, although it can occur as a standalone difficulty. Children with phonological difficulties are likely to have difficulty with all aspects of phonological awareness. For example, discriminating between sounds or holding several sounds in their short-term memory and blending sounds. A phonological delay is the term we use where a child has patterns of speech which are more typical of a younger child. So their sound system is developing normally, but at a much slower rate than expected. A phonological disorder will often involve some sort of delay, but the child also tends to use processes or speech sound substitutions that are atypical or inconsistent and don't follow the normal pattern of phonological development. And this is more likely to make the child's speech unclear, and often specialist support is needed from a speech and language therapist. Developmental verbal dyspraxia is a condition where children have difficulty in making and coordinating the precise movements needed to produce clear speech. And usually there isn't any sign of damage to nerves or muscles. Although it is speech that is mostly affected in verbal dyspraxia, children can also have difficulty moving their mouths, lips and tongues for things like eating, and that's called an oral dyspraxia. Sometimes children also have a more generalised dyspraxia and have difficulty coordinating their body movements. So, what causes speech sound difficulties in children? You might want to pause the video here and jot down some ideas. I wonder if you thought of cleft palate. Children born with cleft lip or palate might be affected and find it hard to produce sounds clearly. This is because the palate plays an important role in speech production as it closes off the nose from the mouth during speech. Where there's a problem with the palate, it's hard for children to make sounds such as b, d, s, etc. Children with cerebral palsy often have difficulty with their speech. In fact, a 2012 study conducted by Swedish researchers found that speech problems affect more than half of all children with cerebral palsy. Some children with cerebral palsy have difficulty controlling the muscles in their face, throat and neck, and this can lead to difficulty with speech and chewing and swallowing. Children with a developmental delay might also have difficulty with their language and speech sound development, but generally their speech and language development is in line with their general development. Children with hearing losses, either caused by middle ear problems such as glue ear or congenital difficulties affecting the inner ear or auditory pathway, can have difficulties with speech. And this is because hearing is critical to speech and language development. For the majority of children, though, there is no clear identifiable cause for their speech sound difficulty. Speech and language therapists will try to find out where the child is having difficulty. In other words, the level of the breakdown. This model of speech processing was developed by Stackhouse and Wells. It shows that a child may have difficulty at different areas. So, at the input area, the child may have difficulty hearing or discriminating between sounds. For example, hearing the difference between a b and a p, or a s and a sh. Or they may have difficulty discriminating between real words such as sock and non-words such as vos. A child may have difficulty at the level of lexical representation. So this is where information is stored about the meaning of a word and how it's produced. For example, the number of syllables, where the stress is, and what sounds the word comprises. A difficulty at this level may mean a child has difficulty with reading and spelling. It's important, however, to bear in mind the child's age and what's expected in terms of the child's knowledge and awareness of sounds at any given age. And later on, Pooja will have a look at ages and stages of speech development in more detail. A child who has a difficulty at the level of output might find it hard to produce the sounds clearly by knowing where to position their tongue or lips. This is what we referred to earlier as an articulation difficulty. Researchers Bishop and Adams have noted that children who do not resolve their speech and or language difficulties by about the age of 5.5 are likely to have persisting speech and or language difficulties and associated literacy problems. And this really emphasises the need to work on speech and language at an early age, ideally while the child is at preschool.
There is research that shows that across the world, most children's consonants were acquired by 5 years old. By 5, children produce at least 93% of consonants correctly. And you can see the specific sounds that they acquired here between the ages of 2 and 6. This picture is based on 15 studies on over 7,000 children speaking English in several countries including the UK. This is a similar but slightly different visual based on a more recent study by the same researchers, and it's based on over 18,000 children speaking English in the US. The take-home message from these studies is that nearly all speech sounds are typically acquired by age 6 and the majority by age 5. So how clear should a child's speech be? Flipson found the levels of intelligibility that a child should be at different ages. At 1 year, strangers should understand them 25% of the time. At age 2, half the time. At age 3, about 3/4 of the time. And at age 4, they should be fully intelligible. So it's okay for a 2-year-old not to be understood half the time. Just to reiterate that these are norms for strangers to understand children. Parents are able to understand children better as they spend the most time with them and are also attuned to their specific speech patterns. At age 1, parents will also understand their children 25% of the time, but at age 2, they will understand them 50 to 75% of the time, and at age 3, they'll understand their children 75 to 100% of the time. So when talking to parents about referring to us, you can distinguish between the fact that they can understand their children better, but strangers will not be able to as efficiently as parents do. Children who speak more than one language acquire sounds at roughly the same times as children who speak one language. In school, if a bilingual child is displaying difficulty with saying sounds in English, it's most likely that they will be having difficulty saying sounds in their home language. It's a good idea to ask parents to just confirm if this is the case. When we see bilingual children with speech sound difficulties, we'd want to look at the sounds across all the languages that they speak during assessment and intervention, which may be done with an interpreter. This is because if you work on sounds in one language, for example, English, it won't necessarily mean that the sounds worked on will generalize to be used correctly in the home language. This is because phonological rules are sometimes different across languages, and so they need to be targeted in each language. Take a child who speaks English and Mandarin, for example. Here you can see some sounds specific to English, some only to Mandarin, and some overlapping sounds. If we targeted the sounds in English, we'll be left with several untargeted sounds in Mandarin. When speaking English, the child will be intelligible after intervention, but when speaking at home or with family, the child's Mandarin may still be unintelligible because there are sounds that haven't been targeted. Not targeting sounds in the home language could impact negatively on the child's cultural identity and socializing with family members. So it's important to consider this at all stages of their speech and language journey, including the identification stage, referral stage, assessment stage, and intervention stage. Here are some typical patterns of speech sound errors. The most common patterns we come across are final consonant deletion, fronting, cluster reduction, stopping, and weak syllable deletion. Examples of what this would look like for final consonant deletion are saying pi instead of pig and co instead of comb. This process is typically gone by 3 years and 3 months. Then there's fronting. This is when back sounds like k and g are replaced by sounds produced at the front of the mouth, like t and d. So the child might say tar instead of car. This is typically gone by 3.5 years. You could also have a combination of processes, for example fronting, with final consonant deletion, where a child might say do for goat, where they've replaced the g with d and missed off the final sound. Cluster reduction is when you have a cluster or blend of 2 or 3 sounds, like sp in spoon and cl in clean. This process is usually gone by 4 years. Stopping is when hissy, or what we'd call fricative sounds, are stopped. For example, replacing b for f, d for z, and t for sh, and this is gone by 3 to 4.5 years. This range is wide because stopping affects several later sounds as well, like sh, ch, and j. Weak syllable deletion is when the syllable that has the least stress is omitted. In banana, the strongest stressed syllable is the first na, and the weakest is b, and so b is missed off to say nana. This pattern is gone by 4 years. When a child shows typical patterns beyond these ages, they would usually be diagnosed with a speech delay by a speech therapist. Then you have atypical patterns like backing, initial consonant deletion, and the use of unusual sounds. There are no age norms for these patterns as they aren't part of typical development. The first example on here is backing. This is when front sounds like t and d are replaced by back sounds k and g. So saying gog instead of dog, and saying key instead of tea. Aside from an underlying phonological difficulty, this can also be caused by excessive use of a dummy. This is because when a child is using a dummy, it prevents the tongue tip from lifting up to produce front sounds like t and d, and the tongue has no option but to lift up at the back and produce k and g instead. Over time, this can become habitual and result in backing. Then you've got initial consonant deletion. This is when the initial sounds in words are omitted, for example saying ummy instead of mummy, or ow for cow. Children can have unusual sounds like the lateral S sound, where air escapes from the side of your mouth rather than through the teeth, or glottal stops, like saying Mitty Mouse instead of Mickey Mouse. Other atypical features include vowel errors, like saying baby for baby, or having inconsistent productions, like saying via, higher, or buyer for the target word fire. Atypical patterns usually result in children being more difficult to understand by others. A child with atypical patterns may have a speech sound disorder, which again is diagnosed following assessment by a speech therapist.
To help us think about the difficulty children face when we're trying to correct their speech sounds, you might like to try this exercise now. Imagine someone says, from now on you can't use the sound s anymore, and in its place you have to use the sound k. Try saying this phrase, and instead of saying s, use a k. Pause the video now and have a go. So how did you find that? This gives us an idea of just how difficult it is for a young child to learn to say words using a different sound. As you can see, it's going to take a lot of work and practice, and as adults we need to be patient. One of the approaches speech and language therapists use when helping a child with unclear speech is to use a step-by-step approach. This is the approach we're going to focus on in this video, and it's suitable for children with a range of speech sound difficulties, including phonological delay and disorder, and for some children with an articulation difficulty or developmental verbal dyspraxia. The therapist will, however, advise you on the best approach to use with a particular child. We're going to have a look at each of the steps into learning sounds in more detail, starting with listening for sounds. Speech and language therapists will usually begin by seeing if a child can hear or tell the difference between sounds. Typically, they'll use the sound that the child is finding hard, for example, s, and the sound that they use in its place, for example, d. When we're working on listening, it's a good idea to use a visual prompt, such as a picture or object that the child can associate with the sounds. For example, the picture of a snake for s, or a picture of a drum for d. You can also use sound symbol pictures, for example, Jolly Phonics or Nuffield pictures. Or if the child is slightly older, you might want to use the written letter. Here are some examples of Jolly Phonics symbols for s and g. Now, can you think of any activities you could do to help a child to listen and discriminate between these two sounds? Pause the video here and jot down your ideas. Did you think of any of these ideas? Some of these are simple reward type games, for example blowing bubbles as a reward for the child choosing the correct sound. You can also place the two sound pictures on a table and say one of the sounds and see if your child can put the correct picture into a posting box or put a brick on the correct sound. We may also work on helping a child to hear the difference between sounds when they're said in words, and often we'll use what's called minimal pairs. So in phonology, minimal pairs are pairs of words or that differ in only one sound and have distinct meanings. And they're used to show the child that there are in fact two distinct sounds, for example p and b rather than just one. The examples here are bin and pin and bow and pow. And we'd use these pictures with a child who's finding it hard to use the sound p and is replacing it with b instead. For children with phonological difficulties, these are a key part of therapy. And these listening games help to develop the child's phonological awareness, so their knowledge of what sounds make up different words. And this is an important skill for literacy development. You may also want to do something called target error work. This is a bit like minimal pairs, and it targets the child's stored representation of what the word should sound like. So in this game, we would say the target word, for example, cup, and then the child's production, for example, tup, and see if the child can tell which is the correct one. It's only really when they can tell the difference between the correct version of the word and the incorrect one that they'll then be able to change their own pronunciation. For some very young children, they may not be able to take part in structured listening tasks, so we may use an approach called auditory bombardment. When we use this approach, the child listens to the target sound in everyday situations over and over again. And this approach gives your child the opportunity to hear the sound they're struggling with lots and lots of times. So, for example, we might make a game about a busy bumblebee if the child is having difficulty producing the sound b. And this is a nice example here. The next step on the staircase to learning sounds is getting the child to make the sound on its own. We can help the child to make the sound correctly by saying the sound, by showing the child where to put their tongue or lips, or by encouraging them to look in the mirror and try to copy our mouths or tongue placement. Sometimes it can be helpful to put jam or chocolate spread on the inside of the mouth or the part where you want them to put their tongue. For example, if you were trying to get them to do a t sound, then you might put the jam on the roof of the mouth just behind the teeth. With words with sounds such as k and g, it can be helpful to use a spoon to hold down the child's tongue, so keeping the front of the tongue at the bottom of the mouth, so the back of the tongue is raised on the top of the palate. Videos and apps can help you to show the child the correct tongue placement for these sounds. Once a child can say the sound on its own, so they can produce, for example, a b clearly on its own or a s clearly, then we're ready to practice the sound in simple syllables. So this is where the child practices the sound and a vowel, or the vowel and a sound. For example, see or ice if they're working on s. For some children, especially those with developmental verbal dyspraxia, then trying to use a sound in syllables can be hard. So this is a reminder to start with some easy words first, like if you're working on k, you'd start with car and key and ku and k. It doesn't matter if they're made up words, rather than starting with caterpillar and kangaroo and koala, which are going to be tricky for a child to say. One way to encourage a child to say the sound in a single syllable in a word such as key is to break up the word into the first sound, so the k, and the vowel. You can first practice the sounds separately, one after the other, k, e, and then gradually blend them together. And this picture here, which is a bit like a jigsaw, shows a nice way to help a child blend the k with the e sound to make the word key. Here are some other examples of ways to work on sounds in simple syllables using pictures such as these here. So again, you can use motivating games such as fishing and skittles. In this example, the target sound is a t, and we're trying to encourage the child to say it in simple words like tea, to and tie. So you could attach the pictures to the skittles, you could put the pictures under the fish and then child fishes them up. You could also pick one of the pictures, for example tie, and you could throw a dice, and however many it lands on, the child has to say the word tie that many times. At this stage, it's really important that you ask the child to do lots of repetitions of the target sound in different syllables and with different vowels. So encouraging tea, to, tie. Once a child can use the sound confidently and consistently in syllables, you can work on practicing the sound in words. This is a step-by-step approach, and it's really key, particularly when you're working with children with severe speech sound difficulties or verbal dyspraxia, as these children are likely to need lots of practice at this stage. So start with CV words. For example, if you're working on k, then kuka. Once a child has mastered these types of words, then you can practice CVC words. For example, if you're working on k, then coat, case, for example, and then finally longer multisyllabic words. It's really important when you're working on one sound not to correct all the other sounds. So pause the video now and see if you can think of any more games. Here are some examples of different games you can play to help your child practice the sound in different words. Did you think of any of these? So you could print off pictures of words beginning with the target sound, and you could make them into a fishing game, or print off 2 sets and play a pairs game. You could get your child to hang the pictures on a washing line and practice saying the words. You could hide the pictures round the room, and when the child finds them, they have to say the word. You could put them on skittles, or you could play the dice game, or any kind of reward game, such as colouring or pop-up pirates.
After the child has achieved saying his target sound at word level, they'll move on to saying it in phrases and sentences. This is taken from the Mommy Speech Therapy website, where you will find free picture resources at word, sentence and story level, and also tips for producing speech sounds. In this first example, the target is k at the beginning of words. You can also find words beginning with k that you can insert in the box to make silly sentences. For example, Kim cooked the candle. If the child doesn't achieve the k sound in the middle of the word cooked, that's okay, because we're only focusing on achieving k at the beginning of words for now, and achieving it in the middle will be a separate target and activity. The simpler the sentences are in meaning and grammar, the easier it will be for the child to say the target sound. The second example is working on Z in the middle of words. Susan is spelt with an S in the middle position, but sounds like the Z sound. So we would use words as targets based on their sound, rather than their spelling, which is something else to bear in mind. If the child has difficulty with other sounds in that sentence, again, avoid correcting it and just praise them and give them feedback for the sound that's being targeted. You can combine these activities with rewards and motivating games, like we mentioned earlier, to keep children motivated and having fun. The next step will be saying the sound in stories. You can find short stories like this on the Mommy Speech Therapy website. For younger children, they don't necessarily need to read the story, but can just describe what's happening in the pictures, like Sherry is wearing shoes, or the sheep went on the ship. You can also use storybooks that your child is familiar with. When you use storybooks with children to work on their speech sounds, you can also use a bookmark with the target sound picture or symbol on them, like a pig for the p sound, a snake for the s sound, or a buzzing bee for the z sound. This will remind the child to remember to say their sound correctly when reading, or for younger children when describing pictures. After working on stories, you can begin to work on using the sound in conversation. To start with, it's good to have the opportunity to practice it in a structured way. So you can have a 1-minute timer, for example, and use Nuffield or Jollyphonic symbols for the target sound. In this case, D. Both symbols happen to be a drum for this sound, but they aren't always the same across Nuffield and Jollyphonics. You can also find and make your own picture cards from the internet, or draw them if you don't have these. So you'd show the child the symbol and say, "Let's practice the D sound when you tell me about your favourite story," or when you tell me about your day. So here's a brief example of cueing a child with symbols and Jollyphonic signs in conversation. You can use ticks, counters, and rewards to reinforce correct use of the sound as they say it. Outside of a structured activity, avoid correcting the child frequently to avoid frustration or them feeling like they are making lots of mistakes. Instead, model the sound or word. For example, "Yes, you played with the doggy." With practice in stories and conversation, over time, the target sound will begin to generalize to everyday speaking with others, which is the goal. But there may still be occasional errors that require support. So in other words, the child will need a goal assist from an adult. For example, "Did you mean yion or lion?"
Working on developing a child's sound awareness or phonological awareness is also a key part of therapy, particularly for children with phonological delays or disorders. And these are also important skills that children need when learning to read and write. This table shows the rough ages at which children develop skills such as awareness of rhyme, the ability to clap out syllables, or to blend the sounds in a word to spell it out. The next two slides give you some examples of activities and games you can use to develop these skills. Maybe pause the video here and see if you can think of any more ideas. So books with rhymes are great for developing the child's ability to hear and generate rhyme. For example, Each peach, pear plum, or Room on the broom, or Cat in the Hat. For rhyme production, you could also try putting objects or pictures into a bag. So you might have a cat, a hat, and a dog. And then you could ask the child to pick out or show you the two which rhyme, so the cat and the hat. You could also pick an object out of a bag and ask the child to think of a word which rhymes with it. To practice segmenting syllables or splitting words up into syllables, which is another important skill for helping children learn to write and read words, you could clap out the number of syllables in your child's name or other children in the group or family members. You could have a bag of objects and ask the child to sort them according to the number of syllables. You could make a syllable lotto or ask the child to do some star jumps to mark the number of syllables in a particular word. Alliteration is the awareness of which words begin with which sounds. So, for example, knowing that sea and soup both begin with a s sound. To practice these skills, you could play games such as I Spy or I Went Shopping or Pass It On, where one person says a word, for example, cake, and everyone has to think of a word beginning with the same sound. So in this case, k. So we're coming to the end of this video and hope you've picked up some useful tips and ideas. On the next slide, you'll see some references for background reading or resources and books that you might want to look at. We'd like to leave you with some time to reflect on your learning from the video. So pause the video here and think about one thing that you'll take away from this presentation and one person who you would share your learning with, either at school, preschool, or someone at home.
We hope you've enjoyed our presentation today and have learnt some useful things that you can take with you when working with children with speech difficulties. If you have any questions, you can send us an email or call us at the Children's SLT team at Bromley Healthcare. You can also direct queries to your child's preschool or school SENCO if you're concerned about a child's speech and language, or the speech therapist at your child's school. Thank you so much for watching. We look forward to seeing you at the optional question and answer session with us to discuss any queries or clarify any of the things that we've talked about today.